right. Well, part 2. When you have built up a picture of what you are as a human being, which aspects are within you, then you might also want to know how you can activate the more universal aspects, how you can wake up those super-personal aspects within you. And to explain this, we must firstly dwell by the process of thinking. What is thinking? Well, thinking is, in our opinion, not so much a brain activity, although the brain plays a role in the entire process. Thinking is, in our view, perceiving thoughts. What are thoughts is the next logical question. Well, we could easily give a lecture about this subject, but very briefly stated, thoughts are living energies, are living beings. They are highly undeveloped living beings which slavishly follow the laws of nature, just like iron mortar is attracted by a magnet. And we, human beings, we form their laws of nature. Thoughts live within us. And when we perceive them, we say that we think a thought. How does the process of thinking work? Well, you could compare your capacity to think, so your mind, with a transmitter-receiver, just like a radio transmitter and receiver, or just like you can send a message with your cell phone that somebody else can receive. Now, each radio station has a certain frequency on which it broadcasts. You have a radio station that broadcasts classical music, and if you want to listen to classical music in your car or at home, you must tune your radio receiver into the frequency of that radio station that broadcasts classical music. When you don't tune in your receiver in that radio station, doesn't the music exist anymore? Of course, it exists. Those radio waves are just as good in the air, but you don't hear the music because you have tuned in your radio into another station. Again, your mind is a radio receiver and transmitter at the same time. If you think a thought, you immediately transmit that thought. You send a pulse which another mind, which is tuned into the same wavelength, receives. And with this concept of radio transmitter and receiver, you can solve a lot of psychological riddles. It explains why people don't understand each other. When an intellectual is talking with an emotional person, they don't understand each other, as if they speak a different language. They don't speak a different language, but they transmit thoughts on a different wavelength. It also explains things like telepathy. When two people are at the same level of thinking and both have a focused mind, they can read each other's thought, even if they live thousands of miles apart. It also explains the phenomenon of psychological epidemics. People suddenly think the same thoughts and therefore perform the same actions. There is a strong thought, often transmitted by one or more strong personalities, and those thoughts spread rapidly, just like a bacterium or a virus can spread rapidly. Those thoughts go from mind to mind, from human to human. Such psychological epidemics occurred already before there was mass communication. So long before the Pokemon craze, people were acting suddenly all the same. Think of the Crusades. Thousands of people left their homes and went into a far country. They didn't even know what they were doing exactly and where they were heading for. There were even children crusades. Children left their parents, their home, and went walking. Nobody knew exactly where they were heading for, but they went walking. And what to think about the many wars? The recent war in former Yugoslavia is an example of such a psychological epidemic. Neighbors who lived for many years next to each other were all of a sudden enemies and tried to kill each other. Of course, those psychological epidemics can only arise when people think unconsciously and when they do not control their own thinking process, and especially when they think in the lower thought aspects. People often think that they think their own thoughts, but often they slurp like sponges the thoughts of others. Advertising is based on this principle, and advertising works. Why do you think that the big companies like Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola spend millions on advertising? They don't know how it works, but they know it works. It works because thoughts are living beings, and anytime you think a thought, you transmit it, and other humans who are on the same wavelength may receive it. You understand that advertising can only work because many people have made desire the predominant force in their consciousness. Thinking differently explains in detail the process of thinking and warns you for the dangers of unconscious thinking. This is extremely important, not only to avoid becoming a victim of some psychological epidemic, but also to make you aware of the process of thinking so that you are able to work consciously for the expansion of your consciousness. The fact that we transmit thoughts is also the key to character reform. We will try to explain. What is a character? A character, is that something static, something that always remains the same? No, we say and we believe that if you observe yourself well, you know that you can change, that you are always changing. A character is in fact the sum total of all the thoughts. The basis of your character is actually the thoughts that you think. You can check that out for yourself. Look, thought underlies every action. The basis of every action is a thought, of a series of thoughts. What happens when you repeatedly think a thought and thus perform the same action repeatedly? You create a habit. For example, the habit to drink coffee in the morning, or the habit to read the newspaper before dinner, or the habit to be kind, or who knows, unkind for your neighbor. In this way, you build up your habit pattern, and all those habits make up your character. It's as easy as that. Hence, the age-old axiom, you saw a thought and you reap an action. You saw an action, you reap a habit, and you saw a habit and you reap a character. So if you transmit thoughts of personal nature, then you build up a habit pattern where your personal ego always plays the major role, and you have a character that is mainly colored by your personality. Well, this applies to all of the 7 thought aspects. So if you, for example, live mostly in the intellectual thought aspect, and you are a true intellectual, then you transmit and receive especially intellectual thoughts. You can analyze and categorize things well. But if you are somebody who lives mainly in the desire thought aspect, and then you belong, I think, to the great majority of people, then you transmit only desire thoughts, and is desire the main characteristic in your consciousness. Is that characteristic very strong in you, it may even take the lead in your consciousness. And unfortunately, this happens all too often. And then you should not only think of humans who are addicted, but also good citizens who only live to satisfy their own desires. Again, advertising works, and it works because the force of desire dominates in so many people. But please note well, there is no doom, there is no compulsion. No one forces you to be who you are. You are consciousness. Your consciousness is sevenfold. You can also make use of other thought aspects. You can develop the higher thought aspects. There's something very interesting in the process of transmitting and receiving thoughts. On the frequency on which you transmit a thought, you get one. So if you are cooperating just in the desire domain, you will receive only thoughts from desire. Then you will never catch a philosophical or a religious thought. And here lies the key to character reform, character change. You know, character reform should never start by learning different actions or acquiring different habits. You start at the root, and the root is your mind. The root is your thinking. You know why we don't experience in general our divine heart? We told you that a human being is spirit, soul, and body. But why do people in general experience so little of their spirit? Where are those spiritual qualities? Well, the answer lies in the model of transmitter and receiver. As long as we transmit thoughts that are directed to the external world, which, as we said before the break, is an illusion, we will never experience something of our heart, never perceive the noble aspects in our consciousness. Yet, everybody has experienced moments when he is in touch with his inner heart. Only because of the hustle and bustle of modern life, because of the noise and rush of people, we ignore those moments and think that these moments are fake dreams. But that's not true. The hasty outer world is rather a dream. Our inner life is much more durable and much more real. If we think thoughts of super-personal nature, we will also receive super-personal thoughts. How do we do that? First, you must ask yourself, where do I stand? Which of these aspects dominates in me? Is that desire? Is that the intellect inside? In that process, the unfailing touchstone is to ask yourself whether a thought is personal or super-personal. Does a thought give you the illusion that you are separated from others? Is the focus on your personal ego? Or does it give you an idea of interconnectedness so that we perceive that we are a part of a bigger whole? The next step is that we must empty ourselves of all those personal thoughts. We must not give them room in our consciousness. I'm not saying that you should fight these thoughts. Thoughts live on our energy, our thought energy. So once you get your mind focused on a thought, it grows in strength. Even if you think it in a negative way, so if you say, for example, I should not be jealous, or I should not smoke, or I should not be unkind to my neighbor, although you might have a good intention, nevertheless the thought that you want to get rid of will become stronger because you feed it with your mind. What should you do then? You need to think a thought of an opposite characteristic. So, if you think of yourself that you are envious, then you have to create an image, a mind picture of somebody who is friendly, somebody who is happy because of others. Thoughts tend to come back cyclically. They are living beings and manifest themselves like all living beings in cycles. Observe your own thoughts and you will notice this fact. The interval may be large or small. At Christmas or the first beautiful day in spring, we think, for example, always a certain type of thought, and they come back every year. The interval may even be greater, a few years. If you meet an old friend you haven't seen for a long time, then you suddenly think a certain type of thoughts you haven't thought for maybe many years. But if you quit smoking, the thought of the cigarette may come back every few seconds. The cyclicity is also the key to change. Whenever a thought comes back to you, a thought that you want to get rid of, comes back to you, you have to link a different thought of an opposite characteristic to it. Of course, the first thought will not disappear at once when it comes back, but stuck to it is the second thought with a totally different characteristic. You have to give that second thought more energy, more strength. It's like a train that constantly comes along. And whenever it appears at the horizon of your consciousness, copy a train wagon on it. And at a given time, the first thought will be completely eclipsed by the others. But it is even better to work proactively on character improvement. And that means that you don't fight your character flaws, but you start to get an idea of what you know deep inside you should be. Look into your own heart. Open up to your own higher aspects. And then the lower aspects will disappear like snow in the sun. In other words, we need to make a picture, a mind picture, of the nobler part within us. Every thought we devote to it has results because what you transmit, you receive. Do you transmit thoughts of the Buddhic level, then you receive thoughts of that level as well. Then you get insight, understanding, compassion. You will even experience the oneness of life. It is for that reason that in the lessons 9 and 10 of Thinking Differently, students are encouraged to build up an idea of the noblest and loftiest what they can imagine. Form a mind picture of universal brotherhood. How does universal brotherhood look like? How does the most noble and lofty society function? What kind of people live there? How do they live? How do they think? How do they act? Obviously, it is a positive image, so don't say how such a world does not look like. We all know that in an ideal society there is no war, but don't focus on war. There's peace. Well, give a description of a peaceful world. In short, you are encouraged to activate your Buddhic ability. Idealism is closely linked to Buddhic thinking, thinking in large context. You can see the relationship between seemingly unconnected things. An ideal is a mind picture of something that is not yet realized. It is not manifested, but it exists. It does exist. Everyone has ideals. Everyone knows that some things can only be realized in the future. But often people have personal ideals. They think that their happiness is somewhat isolated, as if their happiness has nothing to do with the happiness of others. Some people have an idea, a beautiful house, of a new car, or a world trip, but all those personal ideals never bring happiness. These are rather wishes, desires, and even if they come true, which doesn't happen often, they lead to more and greater wishes. The fulfillment of these wishes is like quenching your thirst with seawater. The more you drink, the greater your thirst. The main concern is therefore to form a super-personal ideal. And you know that super-personal ideal, the ideal of universal brotherhood, already exists. That's perhaps the most important lesson we can learn. When we talk about the expansion of consciousness, it doesn't mean that we have to invent something new, as if we would have to add something to our consciousness. That's not the case. Consciousness is essentially everything, limitless. So we must not invent anything new. We have to activate something that already exists, something deep in us. We possess it. We have to wake it up. We have to bring it outside. Should we withdraw from the outer world to develop our spiritual faculties? No. You may live in society with your family, your work, your colleagues, your neighbors, and yet live according to your super-personal ideal. In fact, life in the outer world is our learning experience, is our best school. There we must learn to express what we are in the deepest of our spiritual heart. Certainly, it is sometimes useful to ponder these things in silence before bedtime or just after waking up are excellent moments to recharge your spiritual ideal. But you have to live it. And you can only live it in cooperation with other humans. It is not merely a nice theory which has no value in daily life. No, the contrary. We sometimes say that a student in Theosophy lives in the world but doesn't belong to the world. There's a difference between the two. Look, the objectives of a true Theosophist are not to be found in this outward, in this perishable world. He has a broader vision which does not cover only this life, but it covers many lives. A vision that doesn't only aims his own happiness, his own adventures, but seeks the spiritual welfare of the whole, of every human being, of every living being. And therefore, he does not belong to the world. However, he lives in the world with his fellow men, and only in the world he can live up to his ideal. A true Theosophist, and a true Theosophist is not necessarily a member of a Theosophical organization, lives in the higher thought aspects, in the Buddhic or even in the Atmic thought aspect. And because he lives in those higher aspects, he transmits thoughts of that quality, the quality of the heart, and will therefore also receive thoughts and ideas of that quality. And then suddenly it turns out that he has insights, has grander visions, yes, has talents of which he had not the slightest idea to possess them. That is the great adventure of thinking differently. We see that often happen among people who do the course. They didn't know what they were capable of. But beware, we don't want to create false expectations. In Theosophy, it never is about the person himself. So when you start the course solely on the grounds that you thereby acquire more talents which you want to use for your own benefit, then you will always be disappointed. After all, if you discover and develop the higher aspects in yourself, you also develop compassion, because compassion is actually the realization of the interconnectedness between all living beings. So you can identify yourself with others, consider their problems as your problems, and help and inspire them effectively. Moreover, you acquire insight into the inner links between people and the rest of life, and therefore you can help with wisdom. Helping doesn't mean that you solve the problems of others. You don't fulfill the duty of others. The duty of another person, says the Bhagavad Gita, is fraught with danger. You never use your power of thought to encourage another person to do something that you want him to do. That is a disastrous path which only produces harm. You know, people who think that someone else must do what they should have done when they were in their place. But the intention of the course Thinking Differently is not to teach you what you should think. No, the idea is that you learn to think independently, that you learn what is thinking, which thought aspects exist, how to focus my mind, how to develop the unexplored territories of my mind. We should be the master of our mind and not the slave of the thoughts of others. Now, if you know your own mind, if you know your consciousness, and the course Thinking Differently gives the opportunity to get to know yourself much better, then you can learn to be the master, the king of your consciousness. And so you are able to determine your own life, you determine your life course, and choose to be a part of the solution of this disharmonious world of today. Well, friends, what did I tell you? Thoughts are living beings. A mind is a transmitter and receiver of thoughts. I told you about the cycle of thought, action, habit, character. On the same wavelength on which you transmit thoughts, you receive them. Character reform. First, self-examination, emptying your mind of personal thoughts. Thinking thoughts of an opposite characteristic than the thought you want to get rid of, yeah? Make a mind picture of how you know you should be. And the aim of the course, Thinking Differently, is that you learn to think. Any questions?
I would like to add that you learn to think consciously.
To think how? And not what?
The aim of the course Thinking Differently is how you learn to think consciously. Other question?
The 7 aspects of thinking. Can you show them?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is it possible that you have intuitional feelings?
Yeah.
Sharira together?
It's a good question. We just told you a little bit about everything because in the course, Thinking Differently, we explain it more extensively, of course, but feeling and the Buddhic aspect of thinking, so intuition, there's sometimes a confusion between those two. They think they are the same, or what's the difference? Well, feeling and intuition look the same, but they are different. And the first thing I want to say is that in the feeling thinking aspect, there is always an ego, always an I. It's always about me. Intuition is super-personal, impersonal. There is no I in it. You may distinguish feeling from intuition by asking yourself how you can intellectually explain an intuition. For instance, I have an intuition that I should do the course Thinking Differently. Yeah? I feel I have to do it. Well, it may be just a mere feeling, yeah? Now I'm going to examine, yeah? Why do I want to do the course Thinking Differently? What's the reason? And then you get answers, and those answers, if it's good, will satisfy you, and you really are going to do the course Thinking Differently. Yeah? If it's just a mere feeling, you don't get any answers. But yeah, there are those people who say, "Well, I don't like my neighbor. I feel it. It's not a nice guy. Why? Well, just a feeling." Well, that's not intuition. If it's intuition, you have to explain it for yourself, and sometimes it will take some time to explain it. Real scientists, like Albert Einstein, were very intuitive, yeah? Had a good intuition. They had some idea about the universe, and then he tries to intellectually explain it, yeah? So, intuition is always super-personal, gives an idea of something, yeah? Something is a kind of truth. And because we are not very accustomed with intuition, we have to analyze it ourselves, and if we cannot analyze it, if we cannot explain it for ourselves, then be careful, it may be just a feeling. After some while, if you are more trained in the 7 thought aspects, then you easily know if it is an intuition or is it a feeling, yeah? You get used to it, and you know the intuition is really impersonal. It's something that doesn't say anything about the personal ego, and a feeling, changes quickly. Sometimes you feel something, and 2 days later you don't feel it anymore. Yeah. So. Any other questions?
You spoke about consciousness and the mind, and you didn't say a lot about the physical brain, whereas in particular in the Western world, people seem to think that man is his brain, is his physical brain.
Yeah.
So what would you say to those people?
Well, the brain is a part. The physical brain is a part of our vehicle, of our body, and it's an instrument used by the mind, by the consciousness, to express some thoughts on the outer area, the outer world. But we don't think with our brain, we think with our mind. And when we think a thought, a thought has, just like any other living being, a vehicle, and the vehicle is that electric current you can notice in your brain. And that part, that physical part, you may call the body of the thought. But the thought itself, the force, the consciousness of the thought, is something you can measure with the instruments of the outer world, of the physical world. So we can think without our brain. Yeah? But in the state we are today, and we human beings are more or less focused on the outer world, we need our brain to think in this outer world. It's like what's the word? An intermediaire. I'm looking for another word.
Interface.
An interface. Yes, that's the word. An interface between your mind and the outer world. Nothing more than that. And of course, if you have some troubles with your physical brain, you are not able to express yourself in the outer world. And there are some interesting cases about people who had a brain infarct, and they were thinking quite clearly, but they were talking nonsense. They were talking like, yeah, no sounds, just sounds, no words. But in their mind, in their thinking, they thought they were using words. And people spoke to them, and they could hear sounds, but they couldn't interpret the sounds as words. So that is I think an indication, if not an evidence, that they thought with their mind, but because their brain was in some parts of the brain didn't work, they couldn't transmit the thoughts to the outer world, and the sounds of the other people they couldn't interpret like words, and therefore for them they couldn't see them as words. You get the point? So they think really with their mind, but were not able to put the thoughts in words, and vice versa. And after a while, when the damage in the brain was more or less repaired, well, they could hear the words again and they could speak again. There was a French farmer who had a surgery in a hospital, and they discovered that he missed a big part, 50% of his brain. Nobody had noticed. Yeah? So in Holland there is a famous book, You Are Your Brain. In America, a psychiatrist has written a book, You Are Not Your Brain. Yeah? So the brain is just the interface, a necessary interface, just like all our organs and all our body is an instrument of our mind. And to be able to live in this outer world, we need, of course, our brain and our heart and our organs and our body. But we are not our brain, we are not our heart, physical heart, but we are a mind and a spiritual heart. Yeah? My daughters once had a teacher of philosophy, and he asked them a very good question. He asked, are you a body, or do you have a body? Well, that's a very important question that everybody has to answer for himself. If you are a body, then you are your brain. But if you possess a body, then you are something else that makes use of a body, just like a driver in a car uses a car to drive, but he is not his car. For those who are interested, 2 years ago we had a symposium about consciousness and the brain. We have Lucifer, our magazine, Lucifer, the Messenger of Light, in English. It's on our website so that we can read everything of it. Any other question? Yes?
Well, I thought about the idea that something confuses me, that sometimes ideas that you, when you have a thought, it's better to forget the thought. And sometimes it's better when you have a thought, to put another thought by it. So when I think about the idea of the symbolic idea that you have a tablecloth idea effect. I'm not sure I can put it right to words, but that you, how do you say, verheffen, veredelen?
Lift up.
Yeah, lift up. Is that? I'm a little bit mixed up by those two ideas.
Well, I think it's actually the same. Yeah, it's not. In fact, if you have for instance, a thought of an ugly thought, yeah, you don't like your neighbor, and you recognize it in yourself, and then you say to yourself, well, every time when I think that ugly thought, I have to think another thought, and that my neighbor has also good qualities and he's nice. So in a way, the second thought will take the energy out of the first thought so that you forget it. But what happens, in fact, is that you make the first thought nobler. You take it, as it were, upside. And that is the whole purpose of the evolution of man. It's not that we have to eliminate, yeah? We have to kill all those lower thought aspects, but we have to make them more pure. So we have to make our desire more pure, not selfish desire, but unselfish desire. The fatality, the prana, our feelings, even our physical part, we have to make pure, unselfish, and noble them. So that, I think, is what you do when you think and thought of an opposite characteristic. In fact, the thoughts we think are our children. So, a mother doesn't kill her children. But when the children are doing nasty things, ugly things, selfish things, the mother tries to elevate them, to teach them not to be like that. And that, in fact, is what we are doing when we are thinking those more beautiful thoughts, the spiritual thoughts, than we... For instance, I can go to the supermarket and buy my bread and my vegetables, and I can do it in two ways. And I have to go to the store again, and a lot of people, and yeah, you cannot do it in a light way, you know, not being happy to go there, but do it because, well, you have to do it. So that's, I may even say you can do it in a spiritual way. Yeah? So the spiritual way in the first place is much more easy. Yeah? You do it with a smile. And but the thoughts you think, you will lift up. So if you make an ideal of universal brotherhood, and that ideal of universal brotherhood is always with you, all the other thoughts you think will be influenced by that ideal. We always give the example of a pregnant woman, a woman who is expecting a child. She does everything she has to do normally. Yeah, she goes to the works, yeah, she makes the cooking and so on. But in the background of her mind is the idea that in a few weeks or months she is going to get a baby. And that idea, yeah, colors, ennobles all the other thoughts she has. Well, that's more or less the idea. So when we have that ideal of universal brotherhood, yeah, when we have a clear mind picture of it, it colors all the other thoughts we are thinking daily. Even when we put the rubbish outside, yeah, we can do that in a way, in a spiritual way.
Then you can sing, "My brother, clean it up."
Yeah, but Yeah, because everybody has his function in society, and no one is better than another, so no work is better than another. Yeah, really. Yes?
Before the break, there was this statement of you, it was self-consciousness means responsibility.
Yeah.
Is this what you mean by that? That everyone
Yeah.
has these faculties?
Yeah. We can look at ourselves. We are self-conscious beings, so we are responsible for our thoughts and for our actions. We cannot say, well, it's not my fault. Yeah, it's your fault. You are a self-conscious being. So you can choose. You have a free will. You can choose the left or the right hand path. You can choose for yourself, be selfish, or you can choose for the community, for the whole, and be unselfish. You are responsible for it. If you will attend, I'm just talking to you, but I'm talking to all the people on the internet as well, of course. If you will attend the other lectures this year and next year, we will surely talk about karma, cause and effect, and all those other lectures, Theosophical lectures, will explain a lot of the things I'm just briefly stated today, because I'm talking about the cycle of thought, action, habit, character, but you may also say you saw a character and then you reap a destiny, yeah, your karma. Yeah, so the thoughts are not only making your character, but will also make your destiny, and you are responsible for that. So in any situation where you are responsible for it in the sense that you have not just contributed to it, but in fact you have wished to be there. It's your karma, you've made it yourself. I don't know exactly which. In the third, so
December 11th.
in December 11 we will talk about karma, yeah. So we are responsible beings. We cannot hide behind, for instance, yeah, but I didn't make myself, it's my DNA, I didn't make my character. No, we have made our character. We have saw our thoughts. We have reaped a character made by ourselves. We are responsible for it. Yeah? That seems, sometimes people say, yeah, that's very hard. No, it's very honest, and I think it's very human, because that means that you can also change. You can change. Yeah, it's all in your hands.
What about people with psychiatric illnesses, dementia?
Well, that's a very difficult problem, because because they are not all the same, and the second, because it's all karmic cause, of course, but in general you may say that people who are mentally handicapped, they are not spiritual handicapped, they are mentally handicapped. That means that in their thinking faculty there is something because of causes of the past, so that they can not express themselves fully, you know? They are not 100% what they are inside because of one or various disharmonious situations of the past. Well, that's a question of one life, and after that life they will come back, reincarnation, and probably they will be normal people. In fact, we all are a little bit more or less handicapped. Yeah? If I compare myself with the Buddha, I'm very handicapped, yeah? Because a lot of abilities and capabilities a Buddha has, I have not. So if I compare myself with a Buddha, I'm just a poor, handicapped guy. Nevertheless, all those faculties are within me, and I can try to activate them, and if I do my best, it will go quicker, and maybe in a few lives, who knows, you too, we are all ourselves Buddhas, or half Buddhas, or anyway better than we are now. I think it's a good time to stop our lecture. We always end with an invocation. That's not a prayer, but that is an appeal to the atmic aspect in us, so the divinity in us, our inner God. And in this Gayatri of the Rig Veda, thousands and thousands of years old, the image is a golden sun, but the golden sun is our most inner heart. Not something outside, but within us. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant calls of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.